Hi, 310 students. So welcome to week 7. So we're just about halfway done with the semester now. Not quite, another week and a half, but close. And so hang in there, try to keeping up with the class, do the readings and so on. And I think you'll be fine. I've got most of the grading finished, and I think people did pretty well on the papers. So I'm really pleased to see that. So the topic for this week is the counter argument for what we talked about last week, and that is, when markets don't work. Last week we talked about how, at least in theory, markets should work, and the theory is a very kind of eloquent theory. It's a very appealing theory, and it's a very powerful theory because it gives us kind of insight into how this economic system of markets can potentially be so efficient and be such a powerful, efficient, good thing for allocating society's resources and so on. And then also, as we talked about, it can foster democracy. It's conducive to having a society in which there are, a lot of civil liberties, freedom of speech, and so on. And government is not creeping in and looking over our shoulders. Now, unfortunately, the theory is, in some ways, in some parts, and in some time periods, the theory is far from reality. And so markets don't always work the way that they're supposed to in terms of the theory. And so we're going to look at, and again this week, I'm closely following the chapter that we have for this week in the Wright textbook. And he talks about 5 ways in which capitalist markets don't work like they're supposed to. And in fact, they can be economically and socially inefficient. And here are the 5 ways. Information failures, concentration of economic power, negative externalities, short-term time horizons, and the under-provision of public goods. And I'm going to walk through each of these concepts and discuss them in more detail. And I think that they're very helpful for, not only allowing us to kind of see and understand instances or situations in which markets don't work the way they're supposed to, it provides us with a platform or kind of a guideline for how we can correct that problem, what actions we can take to try and either make the markets work more efficiently or do things that the markets are not doing for us. And when I say kind of do things, I'm talking about government planning, government intervention in the economy, government policies, government taking action, whether it be the federal government in Washington, D.C., or the state government, say the state of California, or maybe the city of Los Angeles. These different levels, they can take actions to try to make capitalist markets more efficient. So let's walk through these now, and we'll start with information failures. Now, this first bullet point here is how markets should work in terms of information. We discussed this a little bit last week, that's one of the most powerful things about markets is that it should provide full information to consumers about products. And firms, businesses have an incentive to fully inform consumers about the quality of the product and the safety of the product and so on. And if they don't, people will go elsewhere to do their business, and that company will go out of business. So that, and in other ways, markets are supposed to really generate good information. But the problem is, it doesn't always work that way. Firms sometimes have incentives to hide or distort information, and the incentives are usually monetary. Sometimes it's not in their economic interest or their financial interest to give and disclose full information about a particular product that they're making. So a good example here is, say, false advertising. A company might lie about the quality of the product or the safety of the product. And we see examples of this happening all the time. A couple of years ago, or this was several years ago now, the German auto company Volkswagen lied about the emission standards for its cars. It said that they claimed that the cars did not emit certain kinds of pollution, and this was a big scam. There are other examples. Recently, Boeing, two major planes crashed in the last 2 years because Boeing did not fully disclose information both to their pilots and to the public about how certain computer operating systems within the plane worked. Probably the most, these are kind of big examples, and they can happen at smaller levels too. Your corner grocery store may sell you something without, fully disclosing information about the product. But these are the big examples, and one of the most egregious examples in history happened in the 1960s with the Ford Pinto. And this came out, this was, so they had a faulty gas tank, and they didn't discover the problem until after the car was designed and was in manufacturing and it was on the market. They met and looked at it and said, okay, it's going to cost about $11 per car to fix the problem. We'll have to do a recall. And then they looked at the cost of settling lawsuits for what they estimate would be about 180 deaths per year. And it was more profitable not to make the change. And so if you can imagine that this actually happened. And so at some point, the problem was discovered and there were many lawsuits and so on. It was a real scandal. And this resulted in legislation requiring higher safety standards. And so this is a good example now of, we can think of ways that government does require, through government policies, through government regulations and so on, it requires companies, forces them to give full information about a product. So, excuse me. Okay, the second way that markets can fail is what the author refers to as the concentration of economic power. Now, when markets are working as they're supposed to, firms, again, when I say firms, it means the same as a business or a company, just using those to mean the same thing. So businesses should not become too powerful. The theory just assumes that they won't. And this is where a little bit of a big shortcoming in the theory, because it doesn't account for really why they shouldn't. And as we know, I think just on a everyday kind of level, we know that our economy is dominated by giant corporations. That doesn't mean there are not small businesses that act and behave in the way that the economic theory would predict they would. But there are huge, giant corporations. Now, sometimes these giant corporations do appear to be small businesses. A good example of this is Starbucks. You go to a Starbucks and it has the appearance of a small independent business and operating in the marketplace, like the theory suggests. Yet it's really part of a large corporation. So there's some argument as to, is this a bad thing or a good thing? Is it economically inefficient or efficient? I mean, one can argue that Starbucks, even though it is this huge company, this huge corporation, the individual companies are pretty efficient. You go in there, you get good service, and the prices seem to be reasonable. It's a little bit expensive, I guess. And the quality of the product, you could argue, is good. So just because there's a large corporation doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, but it's something to think about. Now, some other examples, perhaps some other examples of large corporations in our economy are Amazon, Microsoft, Walmart, ExxonMobil, Boeing, General Motors. And one of the downfalls of the large corporation is that they can control prices. Sometimes the term monopoly or oligopoly is used to describe a large corporation. A monopoly is just one large company that kind of owns everything. An oligopoly is a handful, several or a few companies that control a market. In either case, the companies or company has a lot of influence on how the market works. They can sometimes control prices. So a good example of this would be Walmart. Walmart puts a lot of pressure on its suppliers to charge them prices that the suppliers otherwise wouldn't charge. If it was a market where there was a lot of competition and a lot of people kind of supply and demand, all those forces of the individual companies working, we have Walmart, it can basically kind of set the prices, and it can pay its workers a lower wage. And there's, because there's not the same kind of competitive forces that it would face if it had a lot of competition. So there is some debate about this. Some argue also that the large corporation does not innovate. It's not as innovative as the smaller company. A larger corporation becomes bureaucratic and actually sometimes just stymies or stifles innovation. Microsoft, for example, used to have the reputation for stealing the ideas of smaller companies and also buying smaller companies out so they wouldn't face competition. Okay, so I guess we can move on in there. Later in this class, we'll actually look again at economic inequality and return to some of the kind of power of the large corporation. And okay, the third way in which markets don't work is referred to as negative externalities. And this is a very important and often used concept for not only thinking about how markets sometimes don't work in a specific way, but how to make that correction, or how and when government should kind of take some actions. So this is a really interesting one. So according to the theory, no one should be harmed by markets. Markets have a way of making everybody better off. As long as we engage in market competition, you know, markets are so efficient, everybody is okay. However, sometimes our economic activities displace significant costs on others, and it may be unintentional. Um, uh, People doing things in the market may have this negative side effect, and it may negatively impact other people. It may be kind of unintentional. So negative externalities are pervasive. There's a lot of these going on in our economy, but the clearest example to help to illustrate this concept of negative externalities is in the area of environmental pollution. And let's think about, a company that is making something and making something very efficiently. It's doing what markets say it should do. It's making a quality product at a reasonable price for consumers in the market, and it has to do that. Otherwise, consumers will go elsewhere, and they'll go out of business. So they have to do that. But in the process of making this product, they may be generating some kind of waste that is toxic. Now, let's say that this toxic chemical gets emitted into the air, and it affects a nearby community, and it affects them in a negative way in terms of their health. Let's say it causes asthma among children. Now, from the company's perspective, they don't really have an incentive to invest more money to prevent that chemical from getting out of the plant, from leaking and getting into this community nearby. That would cost them some money. And so they don't really have an incentive to clean that up. The people buying the products don't really know about it. They purchase them from all over the world, so that those products are shipped everywhere. And maybe the company doesn't really even know about it. So this is a case of a negative externality. And so here in this situation, governments can kind of intervene and take measures to either clean up and protect the community themselves, or force the companies through regulations and laws to not let it happen, to control the toxic chemical at the site and not let it affect the community. So we can think of other examples, but pollution is a good one. And again, it's just people, groups, communities that are negatively harmed through somebody else's, market activities. The fourth concept is referred to as short time horizons. And this is a fairly straightforward one. Again, markets are supposed to allocate society's resources efficiently. And people are in the marketplace. Everybody's trying to get the best deal for themselves. Businesses are trying to maximize profits, but selling a good quality product at a reasonable price and so on. The problem here is that economic competition leads firms to think only about the short run. They're thinking about maximizing profits for today and tomorrow. The problem is what about future generations? And if we you know, do current production and consumption patterns, are they going to negatively affect future generations, you know, your children and their children? So the economic theory of markets really can't deal with this question very well at all. From the theoretical perspective, economists tend to say that markets will work things out, that they're so powerful, even if we have environmental degradation over time, the market will place incentives on us to clean that up. So it's kind of hard, it's kind of a stretch. It's really kind of like, okay, you know, is that really, how does that fit, how does that figure? How it's almost illogical in a way. So the author has the example, for example, the overuse of natural resources. So the author talks about oil and gas, for example. If those resources are finite and we're going to run out of them, are we using them too quickly? Another example might be our land on which we grow food. Our cities are growing so rapidly that we're losing farmland. And so what about that as a natural resource? You could think in terms of environmental issues also as an example for the problem of short time horizons. If we're trying to maximize profits now, what about, you know, down the road, climate change and how that will impact future generations? And so finally, number 5 is the under-provision of public goods. So markets in theory are supposed to provide for the needs of society, and that we will be pretty well off and comfortable, have a high standard of living. But when the market fails, profit maximizing firms fail to produce adequate public goods. Now this also is a really good concept here. And let's think first about what are we talking about when we say a public good. And a public good is something that benefits everyone in society. Public good is something that benefits everybody in society, hence the term kind of public. A private good is something that's really only going to benefit me if I go purchase it. If I go to the store, or I go to the Apple store and buy a new iPhone, that's kind of going to be mine. And nobody's going to touch it. Nobody can touch it. It's my private good. It's my private personal property. Public good, on the other hand, is something that everybody enjoys, that the community enjoys and needs. Now, there are some things that are kind of straightforward, say like sanitation, okay? Having a sewer system connected to all the homes and everything to provide hygiene and sanitation for a community is essential. We all need that. Health, clean air is a good example. We all breathe the air. No one can say, okay, I'm going to purchase some air and that air is mine and nobody else can have it. It's something that's available to everybody. Another example is education. Our society, as a society, we've decided that, you know, our children should and need to be educated. And it's something that benefits everybody to have an educated population. It benefits the economy. Now, when we talked about the private market, firms will supply goods that consumers demand. So if consumers are demanding more cans of soup, companies will provide it. But when it comes to public goods, it kind of doesn't really work that way. If, for example, people are demanding clean air, doesn't really, there's no market incentive for a company to come in and manufacture clean air. Sanitation, the market doesn't really work to say, okay, a private company is going to come in and provide sanitation, provide, a sewer system, and if you don't pay, we're going to cut it off. Excuse me. Parks are a sorry about that. Another example here, I should have had up here, is a park. Parks are very conducive for communities, for people to kind of get out, for children to play, and so on and so forth. There's not a lot of incentive for a possibility for a private company to say, okay, I'm going to build a park and I'm going to charge people to use it, to come in and out. That kind of doesn't work that way. So we need public goods. Sometimes there's debate about whether or not that public good should be provided by a market or by a private company or not. In many instances, it doesn't make sense for a private company to provide it, and there's no market incentive for it to provide it. So here's a clear case where there is a need for government planning and government involvement in our society and economy. I've noted here as you read the chapter and you get to this section under provision of public goods, there's a couple of concepts that the author discusses that relate to or are a couple of different ways of thinking about the under provision of public goods. And that is the prisoner's dilemma, that's on page 61, and the tragedy of the common, that's on page 62. And you don't have to worry about those two concepts. Prisoner's dilemma can be a little bit confusing. Tragedy of the common is a little more straightforward. But I put this here so I'm not going to ask you a question on the quiz about either of these two concepts, prisoner's dilemma or tragedy of the common. But do feel free to read it. It's very interesting and very useful, and it ties into this idea of the under provision of public goods. And so my last PowerPoint here is the relationship between markets and community. So we've talked about 5 ways in which markets, capitalist markets, you could say, sometimes don't work as they're supposed to. And it results in economic inefficiencies. Now, there's also kind of the human issue and the political issue. There was the argument last week, and this is an argument that's taken to the extreme by libertarians, that a free market economy is essential to having a democratic society. Now, there's another perspective that says, as the authors talked about, that sometimes market economies sometimes counter to building a strong sense of community in our society. Now, the author defines a community as a group in which people are concerned with the well-being of other people and feel solidarity and obligation towards others. It's kind of a formal definition. There's a lot of different definitions of community, and this is something, especially in sociology, that has been subject to a lot of study and a lot of definitions. And so, but we can just kind of think on a basic level here, a community. You think about where you live and the people that you interact with and the places that you go and the things that are important to you, maybe your church, maybe community center, relatives, places you shop, all of these things that kind of form a community, people that you interact with and feel close to. And it's kind of, both ways, that you enjoy them, being with them, they enjoy you, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of, I think we could all say to some degree, is kind of essential to life and to living a good quality of life. The idea here is that the authors point out that capitalist markets are corrosive. I don't know if that's the best word to use, but are somewhat kind of counter to a sense of community. So, and I think this is kind of straightforward if we think about it. Economic theory, you know, we're supposed to be self-interested, individualistic behavior. And according to the economic theory, again, this is a good thing. It's good that people are self-centered. I just want to get what's good for me. And the economist says, you know, that's human nature, and that's a good thing. That puts pressure on companies to make efficient products. Because I'm going to go purchase what the best deal that I can get for myself. And in the long run, we're all better off because of that. On the other hand, is that counterproductive to community? If everybody's just in it for themselves, where is that sense of community? The sense of, you know, having, wanting to care for others, to care about society, to be altruistic. Altruistic is the kind of opposite of just being self-centered. You care about the community, you care about others. Also, markets foster high levels of inequality, and this is also not conducive to generating a sense of community. And we'll talk more about inequality later in this class, but if you have a lot of people living in poverty, and if you have, you know, wealthy people and very poor people, if you especially have communities where there are high levels of unemployment and not many job opportunities and poverty to go along with it, that does not create an environment to generate a strong, thriving community where people are employed and people, you know, the institutions within that community, grocery stores, churches, recreation centers, you name it, are kind of, you know, helping to form a strong bond in the community. So these are two that, this is kind of an interesting thing. The author talks a little bit more about markets and community. I just wanted to emphasize this aspect here because I think it's very relevant and very interesting. Okay, I think that's all I have. And yeah, that is all I have. So we will talk to you guys next week.